You know that feeling, right? That very specific kind of restless energy that just creeps up on you.
Oh, yeah, totally. The midnight itch.
Yes, exactly. The midnight itch, where you realize your current life just, I don't know, it just isn't fitting you anymore. You get this sudden urge to just pack a bag, walk out the door, and chase something completely uncertain.
Just purely because staying still feels worse than the unknown.
Right. Because playing by the current rules is suffocating. And I think, for those of you listening, we've all experienced some version of that in our own lives. Usually it's like a bad job or maybe a stifling relationship or just needing to move to a new city.
Yeah, a personal breaking point.
Right. But what happens when you take that deeply personal, visceral, human feeling and you scale it up to an entire society?
That is such a fascinating way to frame it.
Because imagine like a merchant in Boston pacing the floorboards in the dead of night, realizing that the entire system he's living under is just suffocating him, and that the only way out is to literally tear the whole thing down.
And that is the exact psychological starting point we are working from today, because we are taking one of the most honestly heavily mythologized, rigidly taught events in global history, right? The American Revolutionary War.
Right. Roughly 1775 to 1783.
Exactly. And we are completely stripping away the mythology here. We have this stack of sources provided for our deep dive today, and they offer a highly introspective, uniquely psychological synthesis of this era.
It's not just a timeline.
No, not at all. This isn't a timeline of dates and treaties. This is an analysis of a global empire breaking apart from the inside, viewed through the lens of systems collapsing, and really the raw psychological toll of human beings trying to adapt to that collapse.
Right. And for you listening, that means we're ditching the tidy textbook version. You already know the basics. I mean, you know about the Boston Tea Party, you know Paul Revere, the founding fathers. We aren't here to recite that stuff.
No, that would be incredibly boring.
Right. The mission for our deep dive today is to explore the actual mechanics of this massive historical fracture. Like, how did the systems actually work? Why did they fail?
And more importantly, we're going to look at this through what the source material calls an Addy-tinted lens.
Which is such a cool concept.
It really is. It's the specific psychological framework involving subpersonalities and emotional resilience, which we will definitely break down a bit later. But it basically challenges you to view the conflict not as this inevitable march toward a glorious destiny, but as millions of people actively choosing chaos and uncertainty over control.
Which requires an immense amount of critical thinking, to be honest.
Oh, absolutely. Because the reality of the late 18th century was structurally brutal. And our goal is to synthesize the psychological experience of this rebellion with the hard geopolitical facts of the era.
Right, because if we do this right, we dismantle that simple romanticized narrative.
The pure freedom defeating evil tyranny storyline.
Yeah, exactly. The whole scrappy underdogs in tricorn hats single-handedly beating the evil empire thing. So, okay, let's unpack this. Let's actually dig into the anatomy of how a fracture of this magnitude actually starts. Because you're probably thinking right now, wasn't this just a massive revolt over taxes?
That is the standard narrative, yeah.
Right, we're taught it was all about the Stamp Act and the tea tax. But when you look at the underlying economics in these sources and the political theory of the time, it's just incredibly clear that taxes were just the symptom.
They were just the surface level friction. The actual disease was a complete collapse of legitimacy.
Okay, break that down for us, because I think that's a huge distinction.
Well, to understand the collapse, you have to understand the geopolitical hangover following the 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763.
Right. The French and Indian War, as it's often called here.
Exactly. So Great Britain emerges from that as the dominant global superpower, but they were financially crippled. I mean, they had essentially maxed out the imperial credit card to defend their global holdings.
Which included the North American colonies.
Right. So, from the perspective of Parliament sitting in London, the logic was pretty straightforward. They're looking at the colonies and saying, look, we just spent an absolute fortune defending you from the French. It is time for you to contribute to your own ongoing defense and administration.
Which, honestly, purely from an accounting standpoint, makes total sense.
It does.
You have a massive deficit, you need revenue, so you levy a tax. But I'm looking at the mechanics of mercantilism in these notes, and this is where that simple tax revolt narrative just completely falls apart for me.
Yeah, mercantilism is the key here.
Because it wasn't just, oh no, my tea costs a few pence more. Like, how exactly did this economic system function on a day-to-day basis for, say, a colonial merchant?
Okay, so mercantilism was basically a closed-loop economic system, and it was designed exclusively to enrich the mother country. The colonies were legally positioned as nothing more than resource extractors and captive markets.
Captive markets, that's a brutal phrase.
But it's accurate. Practically speaking, this meant a colonial merchant could not simply sell their timber or tobacco or indigo to the highest bidder on the global market.
So no free market capitalism here.
Zero. They were legally required to sell only to Britain, often at artificially depressed prices.
Yeah.
And conversely, they were forbidden from manufacturing many of their own finished goods.
Wow.
Yeah, they had to buy those back from British factories at marked up prices.
Okay, so it's essentially a massive, non-negotiable corporate non-compete clause
Yeah.
that dictates your entire existence. You're legally barred from trading with, like, the French West Indies or the Dutch. You are completely locked into a monopoly where the other side sets all the prices.
Exactly. You have no leverage, and the British enforcement of this system was becoming increasingly invasive during this time.
Because people were smuggling, obviously.
Oh, rampant smuggling. So the British start utilizing these admiralty courts.
Which were what, exactly?
They were military-style tribunals without juries, and they used them to prosecute smugglers. Plus, customs officials were given these broad powers to just search private property without standard warrants.
So economic strangulation is paired with a stripping away of legal rights.
Rights that the colonists felt they were fundamentally entitled to as British subjects.
Right, but okay, if it's fundamentally an economic grievance, right, like a dispute over monopolies and profit margins, how does that escalate into this massive philosophical crusade? I mean, I'm struggling to see how you get a poor frontier farmer to risk his life, his farm, his family, to fight a war just so some wealthy Boston merchant can get a better price on molasses.
And that is the crucial pivot. That's where the genius of the movement really lies. The economic grievances of the colonial elite had to be translated into a universal language that resonated across class lines.
Ah,
And they found that language in the Enlightenment. The intellectual framing shifted from, hey, you are hurting our profits, to you are violating the laws of nature.
oh, wow. That's a massive upgrade in stakes.
Huge. Thinkers like John Locke had established these theories of natural rights: life, liberty, property, and the idea that legitimate government can only exist through the active consent of the governed.
But wait, the colonists had been reading John Locke for decades at this point. Why did it suddenly become the ideological weapon of choice right then in the 1760s and 70s?
Because the British actions provided the perfect proof of concept for tyranny. When Parliament passed laws like the Coercive Acts,
Also known as the Intolerable Acts, right?
yes, which effectively shut down the port of Boston and placed Massachusetts under military rule. It wasn't just an economic penalty anymore. It was a structural demonstration that the colonists had no voice.
It's physical proof of the philosophy.
Exactly. It proved that a body of men sitting 3,000 miles away could destroy an entire city's livelihood with the stroke of a pen. And the people living there had absolutely no constitutional mechanism to stop it.
It's that ultimate realization that you are just a passenger in your own life. Like growing up and realizing you don't agree with the household rules anymore. Imagine someone across an ocean making the rules for your household, draining your bank account, and when you finally try to speak up, they send an armed guard to stand in your living room to make sure you comply.
It's terrifying.
Yeah. Eventually, you stop asking for a seat at the table and you decide to just burn the house down and build a new one.
Right. And in political science, we call this an identity divergence resulting in a legitimacy crisis.
Okay, break that down. Identity divergence.
So by the mid-18th century, the people living in these colonies were developing a distinct social and cultural identity. They weren't just displaced Brits anymore. They were fundamentally different from the people living in London.
Right?
And when a ruling body exercises extreme power over a population that no longer views that body as legitimate, open conflict isn't just possible, it is structurally inevitable.
Because they're basically living in two different realities.
Exactly. The two sides were operating on completely incompatible visions of what authority even means. The British believed in absolute parliamentary sovereignty. The colonists believed in local self-determination. There is no middle ground between those two concepts.
Right, because if you compromise on your own self-determination, it begins to look like moral surrender.
Precisely.
And you see that exact escalation cycle play out in the trigger events we mentioned.
Yeah.
I mean, a protest over customs enforcement leads to the Boston Massacre in 1770.
Yep.
Then a dispute over a corporate bailout for the East India Company leads to the destruction of property at the Boston Tea Party in 1773, which then leads directly to those coercive acts in 1774.
It is an unstoppable feedback loop.
Right. Protest, punishment, radicalization, harsher protest, harsher punishment. Until finally, the friction just generates a spark at Lexington and Concord in April 1775. The shooting starts.
And once the shooting starts, all those philosophical debates happening in the taverns instantly transform into a terrifying logistical and military reality.
So let's dig into that reality. Because when that quiet frustration finally turns into action, into an actual shooting war, what does that messy, irreversible reality actually look like on the ground? Because, the popular image we all have is very clean.
Very crisp red and blue uniforms.
Right, standing in neat lines in a grassy field, politely exchanging volleys. But looking at these sources, the sensory reality of this conflict was a geographical and tactical nightmare.
Oh, an absolute nightmare. We really have to start with the sheer scale of the geography, because the British were attempting to suppress a rebellion spread across a massive Atlantic coastline, stretching from the harsh, freezing winters of New England, down through these dense, uncharted inland woodlands, and all the way into the brutal heat and swamps of the Deep South.
And the infrastructure was virtually non-existent, right?
And basically none.
I really want you listening to picture this. Think about moving an army of 10,000 men, complete with heavy bronze cannons, massive wagons of black powder, and hundreds of horses.
A moving city.
Exactly. Now try moving that entire moving city through a dense, primeval forest where the roads are literally just dirt tracks cut by indigenous tribes or trappers.
It's agonizing.
Yeah. A single heavy rainstorm turns those tracks into knee-deep mud. A wagon axle breaks, and the entire army just stops.
The environmental friction was staggering, and it directly influenced the hybrid nature of the warfare that developed. Because the British regular army, they were trained for conventional European-style warfare.
Which means lines.
Right. Highly disciplined soldiers forming linear formations to maximize firepower.
Wait, okay, let's break that down. Because to a modern listener, the idea of standing shoulder to shoulder in an open field while people shoot at you sounds completely insane. Why do they fight in lines? Why not just take cover behind a tree?
I know it sounds suicidal to us now, but it was a mathematical necessity dictated by the technology of the era. The primary weapon was the smoothbore musket. Unlike a modern rifle, which has grooves carved into the barrel to spin the bullet for accuracy, like a football spiral, a smoothbore musket is essentially just a metal pipe. The lead ball just bounces down the barrel as it fires.
So it's basically firing a pinball.
Basically. Beyond 50 to 100 meters, it was wildly inaccurate. You could aim directly at a man's chest at 100 yards, squeeze the trigger perfectly, and the ball might miss him by 5 feet to the left.
Wow. So if individual accuracy is physically impossible, how do you actually hit the enemy?
You mass your fire. You line up 70 or 80 men shoulder to shoulder, you point them in the general direction of the enemy line, and have them fire simultaneously.
A wall of lead.
Exactly. You aren't aiming at an individual, you are throwing a wall of lead through the air, just hoping to maximize the statistical probability of hitting something in that general area.
That's terrifying.
It gets worse, because reloading a musket with black powder and a ramrod took a highly trained soldier roughly 20 seconds.
Which is an eternity in a firefight.
You were incredibly vulnerable between those volleys.
Which is why the bayonet was so crucial.
Yes, exactly. The psychological terror of a bayonet charge was often more decisive than the musket fire itself.
The sources have these really intense sensory details. Imagine surviving a deafening volley of fire. The air is instantly choked with thick, acrid white sulfur smoke, so you can barely see the guy standing next to you.
The smoke hung so low to the ground.
Right. And suddenly, out of that thick smoke, a line of disciplined, hardened soldiers is just sprinting at you with 18-inch steel blades on the ends of their rifles.
It broke the nerve of inexperienced troops constantly, just the sight of the bayonets coming through the smoke.
But the colonial forces, they couldn't just fight a purely conventional war, right? I mean, they didn't have the training or the discipline early on to stand against a British bayonet charge, so they had to adapt.
They absolutely had to adapt. They used the terrain. They employed a really effective hybrid approach.
Because Washington was trying to build a real army.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, George Washington desperately tried to build a conventional continental army that could stand toe-to-toe with the British in those open field battles. But at the same time, local militias utilized irregular guerrilla warfare.
The hit-and-run tactics.
Right. Because they understood the terrain in a way the British didn't. They would ambush British supply columns in the woods. They'd use hit-and-run tactics, sniping officers from behind cover, which was considered very ungentlemanly by the British.
Naturally.
And then they would just melt back into the local civilian population before the British could even form their lines to retaliate. The war was less a continuous blaze and more like a campfire that just kept flaring up in different spots.
It must have been completely maddening for the British commanders. You have literally the most advanced, highly trained military machine on Earth, and you are being bled dry by farmers hiding behind rocks who refuse to fight a quote-unquote proper battle.
Oh, the frustration in their letters home is palpable.
But there's another logistical nightmare here that I think is even more fascinating, and that's the communication lag.
Information moved only as fast as a horse could gallop or a ship could sail, period.
It's like trying to play a highly competitive, high-speed multiplayer video game, but your ping is 3 weeks long.
That's a perfect analogy. You are completely desynced from reality.
Right. If you are a British general in New York and you need to coordinate a pincer movement with an army up in Canada, you have to write a physical letter. You give it to a guy on a horse. That rider has to traverse hundreds of miles of hostile territory, dodging ambushes, surviving the weather. If the letter arrives a month later, the entire strategic situation has changed.
The target might not even be there anymore. And this applies to the overarching command structure as well. The British war effort was being directed from London.
Oh, man.
It took an average of 6 to 8 weeks for a ship just to cross the Atlantic. If Parliament issued a new strategic directive, it was based on intelligence that was already 2, maybe 3 months out of date.
So by the time the orders actually reached the generals in America, they were totally irrelevant.
Often, yes. The lag created a system where leaders on both sides were forced to operate completely in the dark. They were acting on partial information, gut instinct, outdated rumors, and sheer guesswork.
Which brings up a critical point about the scale of this war. Because of that lag, and because of the global politics involved, this conflict didn't stay contained to the American woods for long. Once the rest of the world saw the crack in the British Empire, the vultures started circling.
The expansion of the conflict is perhaps the most vital geopolitical shift to understand. Because this wasn't just a local revolt. In 1778, the Kingdom of France formally allied with the United States. And shortly after that, Spain and the Dutch Republic entered the fray as well.
Which completely shatters that local tax revolt mythology. Suddenly, the British aren't just trying to suppress a colonial uprising in Massachusetts, they're fighting a multi-front world war.
The entire strategic calculus changed overnight. Britain had to divert massive amounts of manpower, naval assets, and money just to defend their other global holdings.
Right, because France is attacking everywhere.
Exactly. The fighting spread to the highly lucrative sugar islands in the Caribbean. There were naval engagements in the English Channel. There were even major battles fought off the coast of India between British and French forces.
India. That is wild.
The American colonies became just one theater in a massive 18th century global conflict over the balance of imperial power.
Okay, so we have this sprawling, chaotic, hybrid war being fought across swamps, forests, and oceans, plagued by this massive communication lag. But who exactly is actually fighting it? Because the neat narrative we are fed is patriots versus the British, good guys versus bad guys. But when you look at the societal breakdown in these notes, this was a profoundly messy, incredibly violent civil war happening inside the larger global conflict.
The factional complexity is really staggering. The myth of a unified American populace rising up in unison is entirely false. Modern historical consensus suggests the population was deeply, deeply fragmented. You had the patriots, or revolutionaries, obviously, but even they were not a monolith.
Right, you had radical idealists who wanted to tear down the entire social order, and they're fighting right alongside incredibly wealthy plantation owners who just wanted to remove the British trade restrictions so they could get richer, all while maintaining their own internal hierarchies.
Exactly. Their temporary unifying thread was just the desire for political autonomy. But opposed to them were the loyalists, and this is a demographic that the mythology has largely erased, or, at best, reduced to mere caricatures of villainy.
I really want to focus on the loyalists for a second because understanding their perspective is so crucial. Here's where it gets really interesting for you as a listener, because we assume it was a clear good versus evil fight. But these weren't cartoon villains twirling their mustaches hoping to crush freedom.
Not at all.
They were ordinary people. They were merchants, clergymen, farmers, and often minority groups who looked at the radical patriots and just saw absolute chaos.
What's fascinating here is that the Loyalist perspective was actually deeply pragmatic. This wasn't freedom versus tyranny for everyone, it was order versus autonomy. They believed that the British Empire provided stability, economic security, and the rule of law.
Right.
They looked at the localized violence of the Patriots, the tarring and feathering of customs officials, the mob rule in the streets of Boston, and they feared that an independent American government, completely untethered from British tradition, would be far more tyrannical and oppressive than a distant king.
It's the devil you know versus the devil you don't. If you are a marginalized religious group or a merchant whose entire livelihood depends on British credit, tearing down the imperial system doesn't look like liberty. It looks like societal suicide.
Precisely. And the tragedy of the Loyalists is profound. I mean, families were literally torn apart. Neighbors who had known each other for decades began burning each other's farms. It was war without leaving home.
Thousands of loyalists were eventually forced to flee their homes entirely, right? Becoming refugees in Canada or back in Britain.
It was a brutal, very intimate civil war. And when we look at the global factions, we have to critically examine France's involvement too. Because the romanticized version is that the French heard the ringing bells of liberty and rushed across the ocean to help birth democracy.
Which makes absolutely no sense if you stop and think about it for 5 seconds. I mean, France was an absolute monarchy ruled by King Louis XVI.
Right.
Why on earth would an absolute monarch spend millions of livres to fund a Republican revolution that is fundamentally opposed to the concept of kings? Like, what is their actual agenda here?
Pure geopolitical realpolitik. France's motivation had nothing to do with democratic ideals and absolutely everything to do with revenge and the global balance of power.
Revenge for the 7 Years' War.
Exactly. They had suffered a humiliating defeat by the British in that war, losing vast amounts of territory in North America and India. So supporting the American rebellion was a calculated, cynical maneuver to just bleed the British Empire dry.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
The logic was simple. A weakened Britain elevates France's position on the global stage. It was a strategic play, not a moral crusade. The Americans were merely a convenient proxy in a much larger imperial rivalry.
So France is playing 4D chess. The colonists are fighting a bloody civil war in their backyards. But there are two other massive populations caught in the crossfire whose stakes were completely existential: the indigenous nations and the enslaved populations.
Yes.
For them, this wasn't a debate about abstract political theory. It was raw survival. Let's examine the indigenous nations first, because the myth is that they were either just passive observers or savage impediments to American progress.
The reality is that indigenous confederacies and tribes were deeply sophisticated political entities making complex strategic calculations of their own.
And many of them ultimately allied with the British, which, again, if you just look at the surface, you think, why side with the empire? But when you look at the mechanics of the frontier, it makes perfect sense. The British had established a proclamation line of 1763.
Yes. The British government, seeking to avoid costly frontier wars after the 7 Years' War, drew a line down the Appalachian Mountains and explicitly forbade colonial settlement west of that line, essentially reserving the land for indigenous nations.
Which absolutely infuriated the colonists, because land speculation was basically the cryptocurrency of the 18th century. I mean, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, these guys had vast financial interests in westward expansion.
Exactly. So, from the perspective of many indigenous leaders, the expanding, land-hungry colonial settlers were the immediate existential threat to their sovereignty and their survival. The distant British king, who was at least attempting to restrict that expansion, was the logical ally.
They weren't fighting against American liberty. They were fighting to protect their homelands from an expanding colonial power.
Survival versus ideology.
And then you have the paradox of the enslaved population. This is the glaring, horrifying contradiction in the very core of the revolution. You have a movement supposedly built on the self-evident truth that all men are created equal, led by men who literally owned hundreds of human beings. How did enslaved people navigate this massive hypocrisy?
They navigated it by seeking agency wherever they could find it within a brutally oppressive system. The British recognized the immense strategic vulnerability of the Southern plantation economy early on. In 1775, the royal governor of Virginia issued what's known as Dunmore's Proclamation.
Okay, what did that do?
It explicitly offered freedom to any enslaved person who escaped a patriot enslaver and took up arms for the British crown.
Wow. which was basically an absolute psychological and economic nuke dropped on the southern colony.
Oh, it terrified the plantation class,
Uh,
absolutely terrified
I
them.
bet.
And thousands of enslaved men and women took that terrifying, incredible risk, fleeing to British lines to claim their freedom.
But some fought for the Patriots too, right?
Yes. Conversely, some enslaved individuals fought for the Patriot cause. Sometimes they were forced into service by their enslavers, serving as substitutes. But others fought, hoping that the high-minded rhetoric of liberty might eventually be applied to them.
Hoping for systemic change.
Right. But the grim reality is that neither the British nor the Patriot High Command truly viewed them as equal human beings. They were viewed primarily as strategic leverage or military labor.
So you have all these vastly different factions. Patriots, loyalists, the French, indigenous nations, enslaved people, all fighting completely different wars for entirely different stakes on the exact same physical battlefield.
It's incredibly complex.
And because these groups had such disparate stakes, the war itself didn't progress in a neat straight line. It wasn't a steady march toward victory.
No, not at all. The temporal arc of the war was highly erratic. Because of those vast differences, the war moved in distinct phases, driven as much by logistical collapse and shifting political will as by battlefield tactics.
The sources categorize these phases as the flare, the drag, the surge, the exhaustion, and the resolution. Let's track that momentum.
Okay, so the flare is the beginning, roughly 1775 to 1776.
Lexington conquered Bunker Hill.
Right. The colonial militias are completely disorganized, but they're running on pure adrenaline, localized outrage, and this intense ideological fervor. And this phase culminates in the ultimate psychological break, the Declaration of Independence in July 1776.
A moment the notes actually call a declaration of identity.
Exactly. The Declaration provided the necessary ideological clarity. It transformed a fragmented rebellion against tax policy into a unified assertion of national sovereignty.
But the high of that declaration doesn't last very long, does it?
Yeah.
Because immediately we hit the drag. By late 1776 and into 1777, the adrenaline wears off, and the brutal reality of fighting a global superpower really sets in.
Reality hits hard. The British military machine arrives in full force. They launch a massive amphibious assault and capture New York City, demonstrating their overwhelming naval and tactical superiority. Washington's Continental Army is repeatedly routed. They are plagued by desertion, rampant disease, and a chronic lack of supplies. The momentum shifts violently toward Britain. The rebellion is very, very nearly crushed during this phase.
It's the moment the idealistic startup realizes they are bleeding cash, and the massive corporate monopoly is actively destroying them.
That's a good way to put it.
But then we hit the surge, the turning point. Late 1777, the Battle of Saratoga in upstate New York. Why was this specific battle the pivot point of the entire war?
Saratoga was a monumental strategic shock. An entire British army, commanded by General Burgoyne, attempted to drive down from Canada. The goal was to sever New England from the rest of the colonies.
Divide and conquer.
Exactly, but they were slowed down by the dense wilderness, their supply lines were stretched to the absolute breaking point, and they were ultimately surrounded and forced to surrender by American forces.
Which is incredible. And the importance of Saratoga isn't just that the Americans want to fight. I mean, it's like when you're struggling under a massive weight and you finally realize you're not alone anymore. Everything changes when support arrives. Because Saratoga proved something to the rest of the world, specifically to France.
Exactly. We mentioned France earlier. They had been secretly funneling arms and money to the Americans, but they were hesitant to formally enter a war unless they believed the Americans could actually win.
Right, they didn't want to back a losing horse.
Saratoga proved that the Continental Army could defeat a British regular army in the field. It was the proof of viability France needed. It triggered the formal alliance in 1778, which, as we discussed, tips the scales and transforms the conflict into a global war.
But even with French support, the war doesn't just end. We enter this grueling, horrific phase of stalemate and exhaustion from roughly 1778 all the way to 1781.
The war shifts south.
Right, the British shift their focus to the southern colonies, hoping to tap into a supposed massive base of loyalist support. And what happens down there is basically a descent into total anarchy.
The Southern campaign devolved into a savage, partisan civil war. It was less about massive armies maneuvering in fields and more about localized militias ambushing each other, burning plantations, executing prisoners in the swamps. It was an environment of sheer exhaustion. The systems of society were completely breaking down.
And I really want to pause here and dig into that concept of systems degrading. Because wars aren't just won by generals on horses giving speeches. They are won or lost by logistics and economies.
Always.
We mentioned the long British supply lines earlier. Trying to feed, clothe, and arm tens of thousands of men across 3,000 miles of ocean in the age of sail is an almost mathematically impossible task.
It's a logistical nightmare.
But the American system was collapsing too, specifically the financial system. Let's talk about the continental currency, because looking at this, how exactly did inflation become a weapon that almost destroyed the revolution?
It is a critical mechanism to understand. So, the Continental Congress, which was the governing body of the rebellion, had almost no actual power. Crucially, they did not have the power to levy taxes to fund the war.
Wait, really? A government that can't tax?
I know it sounds absurd. But remember, they were rebelling against taxation, so they were terrified of giving their own government that power. They could only ask the individual states for money, and the states rarely paid.
Right, of course.
So, to pay the soldiers and buy supplies, Congress simply printed fiat paper money, the continental dollar.
And when you just print money with absolutely nothing backing it?
The value plummets. The depreciation was catastrophic. By 1781, the continental dollar had lost 99% of its value. It led to the phrase, not worth a continental.
Wow.
You had situations where soldiers' pay for an entire month couldn't even buy a single pair of boots. The economy essentially reverted to barter. Farmers refused to sell food to the Continental Army because the paper money was completely worthless, which led to the horrifying reality of the army literally starving in the field, while civilian markets, relatively nearby, had plenty of food. The economic collapse was, at times, a greater threat to the revolution than the British Army.
Which brings up a fascinating concept from the sources. Information and morale as a literal strategic resource. When your soldiers are starving, your money is worthless, and your government is powerless, how do you keep an army in the field?
Through the weaponization of ideology and narrative, information warfare was paramount here. Because communication was so slow, misinformation and rumors filled the gaps. Patriots framed it as liberty, while Britain framed it as disorder.
Right.
Leaders like Washington and intellectuals like Thomas Paine had to constantly frame the suffering as a necessary crucible for divine liberty. They had to maintain the narrative that the cause was pure and that victory was ordained, because the moment the morale breaks, the army dissolves and the war is instantly over. Morale became the only currency that retained its value.
So the side that wins is often just the side whose story and supply chains hold together just a little bit longer than the other guys.
That's a very accurate assessment.
And the British system finally breaks first. 1781, the exhaustion phase culminates at the Battle of Yorktown in Virginia.
Yes. The structural realities finally corner the British. General Cornwallis establishes a base at Yorktown, which is on a peninsula.
Bad place to be if you get trapped.
Exactly. Washington's army, heavily bolstered by French troops, marches down to besiege him by land. And crucially, a French naval fleet arrives and blocks the Chesapeake Bay, preventing the British Navy from extracting or resupplying Cornwallis.
He's completely trapped.
Cut off from the system and forced to surrender.
It's the moment the fever finally breaks.
Yorktown effectively ended major military operations in North America. The political will in London completely collapsed. The British public and Parliament were exhausted by the debt, the lack of progress, and the escalating global war with France and Spain.
They just lost the appetite for it.
They realized the cost of subduing the colonies vastly outweighed any potential economic benefit of keeping them, and this realization leads to the resolution phase, culminating in the Treaty of Paris in 1783, where Britain officially recognizes the independence of the United States.
Okay, so the treaty is signed, the British sail away. The myth tells us that a glorious new nation of liberty is instantly born.
Yes, the fairy tale ending.
Right. But when you step back and look at the aftermath, what does winning actually look like? Because winning didn't solve the structural problems, it just changed who was responsible for them.
Exactly.
Stepping into freedom, as one historian put it, is like moving out of your parents' oppressive house, only to realize you are standing in an empty field and you have to build your own house from scratch with no tools.
That is a perfect analogy. The aftermath was incredibly fragile and fraught with dysfunction. Independence is achieved, but the new Republican system is deeply fragile. The immediate governing structure they created, the Articles of Confederation, was a deliberate overcorrection.
How so?
Terrified of replacing a British monarch with an American tyrant, they designed a central government that was intentionally weak. It had no executive branch, no national judiciary, and still no power to tax or regulate commerce.
Which is a disaster. You have a massive national war debt, a ruined economy, and a government that literally cannot function. You have internal rebellions like Shays' Rebellion, where unpaid veterans start shutting down courts.
Exactly. The realization that they had built a dysfunctional house led to the incredibly contentious process of drafting the U.S. Constitution years later, which sought to balance the need for a functional, powerful central government with the deep suspicion of centralized power and the preservation of individual liberties. Winning didn't create instant stability, it created a new struggle over how to govern.
And the ripples of this victory were global and in many ways incredibly tragic. We mentioned France's cynical investment earlier. Well, the bill came due.
Oh, it certainly did. The financial burden of supporting the American Revolution essentially bankrupted the French state. That massive debt, combined with systemic internal inequalities, was a primary catalyst for the French Revolution just a few years later.
Which ironically bankrupts France in the process and tears French society apart.
And led to the execution of King Louis XVI, the very king who had funded the Americans.
A stunning historical irony. And domestically, the new American nation immediately looks west. The British proclamation line is gone. The floodgates open.
Sparking massive westward expansion. This accelerated the systemic displacement, treaty violations, and violence against the indigenous nations. For them, the American victory was a profound geopolitical disaster.
And we return to the most glaring paradox. Slavery. The institution was not dismantled by the revolution. In many ways, the compromises made to form the new nation codified and protected it. The rhetoric of liberty was fundamentally selective.
Which is why we must dismantle the enduring myths.
Right. Let's bust some of those myths right now.
Okay, the myth of a unified, singular fight masks the reality of a deeply divided colonial populace fighting a brutal civil war. The myth of pure underdog grit masks the absolute necessity of massive French global intervention. And the myth of universal liberty masks the tragic reality that freedom was deliberately denied to millions.
So, as a listener, you're faced with a really difficult tension here. If the history is this messy, this contradictory, this deeply flawed, does knowing all this messy stuff ruin the inspiring story of the revolution? Does it negate the achievement?
I would argue emphatically that it does not ruin it. It makes it real. If we connect this to the bigger picture, understanding the immense, brutal cost, the tens of thousands of casualties, the exile of the loyalists, the catastrophic economic ruin, and acknowledging the profound moral compromises makes the history human. It shifts the narrative from a fairy tale to a study of human complexity. They articulated ideals of self-governance and natural rights that were vastly superior to their ability to implement them at the time. But establishing those ideals as the foundation of a new model of government was a seismic shift in human history.
And that profound human complexity perfectly tees up the final and honestly the most fascinating, deeply personal layer of the source material you provided. Up until now, we've been analyzing structural economics, tactical warfare, and geopolitics. But the sources use a deeply psychological framework to process all of this.
Yes.
They view the war through the lens of a specific subpersonality.
The Addy tinted lens.
Right. Before we apply this to the war, we need to clarify what we mean by a subpersonality, because it sounds a bit clinical. If you are familiar with internal family systems therapy or even basic Jungian archetypes, it's the concept that our minds aren't just one solid monolithic block.
We are made of parts.
Exactly. We have different parts, different personas that step up and take the wheel, depending on the situation we are facing. You have your inner critic, your fierce protector, your organized manager.
Precisely. And the specific subpersonality identified in our sources as Addy is not a general or a politician on the battlefield. It is an archetype, the connector, the morale keeper.
The morale keeper.
Yes, the part of the human psyche whose primary function is to maintain emotional warmth, social cohesion, and lightness. Someone who moves between camps, carrying stories, and trying to keep people feeling human.
Imagine being the person whose internal role is to carry the emotional weight of the group. You are the one trying to lift spirits in a freezing encampment when the food is gone and disease is rampant. You are trying to keep people feeling like human beings in a massive grinding machine that is actively trying to turn them into numb, survival-driven soldiers.
It's an impossible burden, and if you place that specific, joy-seeking subpersonality into the brutal reality of the Revolutionary War, the internal conflict is staggering. The sources outline two primary internal conflicts for this persona. The first is the tension between freedom and consequence.
Right. because the Addy persona intrinsically loves the spark of freedom. They resonate with that restless midnight itch we talked about at the very beginning, the desire to break the rules and chase self-determination.
But in a war zone, that persona is forced to witness the physical, devastating consequence of that spark up close. They see the burnt-out farms, the shattered bodies in the medical tents, the divided families, neighbors killing neighbors.
Look at your notes here. This isn't about history anymore. It's about how we process conflict. The idea of holding contradiction. Realizing you can fight for freedom and still cause immense harm. You can believe in something and still deeply question it. The psychological conflict is immense. How do you reconcile your deep love for the idea of freedom with the horrifying, tangible reality of what it costs to achieve it?
Is the theoretical liberty of tomorrow worth the literal blood of the people suffering around you today?
Man. And the second conflict is light versus weight. I think anyone who considers themselves the positive one or the vibe bringer in their friend group could really relate to this. The connector wants to keep things light, but how do you forcefully inject positivity into a room that is heavy with profound grief and trauma?
You cannot. And that is the crucible for this subpersonality. Conflict forces an absolute loss of control.
Right.
In peacetime, we maintain an illusion that we can manage our environment and our emotions, but in war, that illusion is obliterated. Plans fail catastrophically. Outcomes spiral. People die randomly. The logistics collapse. You are forced to confront a reality that is spiraling utterly beyond your grasp.
You are forced to either accept that terrifying lack of control or your psyche just collapses under the weight of it.
Exactly. The connector is forced to realize that relentless, forced optimism in the face of genuine trauma isn't helpful. It's actually a form of denial. And that realization triggers the true emotional transformation described in the text.
The war forces the subpersonality to evolve.
It forces a shift from a spontaneous, reactive kind of joy, which the notes beautifully describe as a wildfire, something that burns hot but is erratic and ultimately destructive if uncontained, into an intentional, chosen light in dark spaces, a hearth.
That distinction between wildfire and a hearth is incredible. Joy is no longer an ignorant escape from reality. It becomes a disciplined, defiant act.
Yes.
It is standing in the absolute worst, the mud, the cold, and the fear, and consciously deciding, I am going to build a fire here anyway. Joy isn't about ignoring the pain. It's about holding the pain and still choosing to maintain your humanity.
It is a profound emotional maturation. The true transformation is coming out of a systemic collapse, not harder, not bitter and closed off, but deeper, more grounded and aware, still capable of warmth and connection, but now carrying the heavy weight of experience intentionally.
It is such an incredibly powerful, unexpected way to view a massive geopolitical war. To reframe the struggle of an emerging nation as a mirror for our own internal psychological growth and the struggle to maintain warmth in the chaos.
It bridges the macro-level collapse of an empire with the micro-level emotional resilience required of the human beings forced to survive it.
So, to synthesize this massive journey we've taken today, we started by unpacking a deeply layered psychological perspective on the American Revolution. We didn't just look at what happened, we look at how and why. We examined the structural breakdown of imperial legitimacy, where the daily economic strangulation of mercantilism evolved into an irreconcilable ideological fracture.
We waded into the sensory, logistical nightmare of the hybrid warfare itself. The clash of line infantry tactics dictated by the physics of smoothbore muskets clashing with guerrilla warfare in the wilderness.
We mapped the immense communication lag that forced leaders to fight in the dark.
And we watched the conflict explode into a global war once France cynically entered the fray.
We analyzed the fractured cast of players, the divided patriots, the pragmatic loyalists, the strategic indigenous nations, and the enslaved populations seeking agency, all fighting entirely different wars on the same board.
We tracked the erratic waves of momentum, driven not just by generals, but by the collapse of supply chains, the hyperinflation of currency, and the weaponization of morale.
And we confronted the bittersweet, contradictory aftermath. A victory that achieved independence but immediately birthed a dysfunctional government. A victory that established soaring ideals of human rights while entrenching the brutal reality of slavery. It wasn't a clean, tidy story of liberty inevitably defeating tyranny. It was a messy, incomplete, agonizingly slow leap into the total unknown.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to carry with you, drawing on the deepest themes we've explored today. We all experience moments in our lives where we crave our own form of independence. Moments where the structures of our lives, our careers, our relationships, our daily routines feel like they are suffocating us.
Where you get that sudden, overwhelming midnight urge to just pack a bag, break the rules, and run towards something new.
Precisely. But when you finally decide to make that leap for your own personal freedom, are you truly prepared for the unresolved contradictions you will inevitably land in? Because as the brutal mechanics of this war and the deep psychological transformation of the Addy persona remind us, every leap lands somewhere. Freedom is not a magical finish line where the music swells and all your problems evaporate. Freedom is usually just a new, vastly heavier set of responsibilities waiting for you on the other side.
A completely new house you have to build from scratch. What an incredibly profound way to look at history and human nature. Thank you so much for bringing these complex, challenging, and deeply human notes to the table. It has been an absolute privilege to dive into the mechanics and the minds of this revolution with you today.